Just to alert our sensitive viewers, this episode may contain a bit of coarse language.
Hello, everyone. My name is Christy Blumendahl.
And my name is Rocco Catroni, and we are the Disability Tangent Podcast.
Each episode, we talk about current issues affecting communities while supporting people with disabilities.
Through research, community connections, and resource sharing, we hope to invite everybody to challenge their perceptions of people with disabilities and promote a more inclusive world.
Defined by what the people actually want and not what others think they want.
Come join us on this journey. All right, so Christy, what are we talking about today?
Today, on the Disability Tangent, we are talking about the subject, quote, fixing. There's a lot of times when I say, as we're talking, I say, oh, my family was trying to fix me, or trying to fix this. And I don't think that we've ever really talked about, what do we mean when we say they were trying to fix me, or what does fixing mean in the context of disability? So I think let's dive into it a little bit. What does the term fixing mean? And if we feel like people are trying to fix us as disabled humans, what are we saying when we say that?
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to mind for me might be wholly academic, so please excuse that.
You're a nerd. It happens.
That's Dr. Reverend Nerd.
I think the Reverend comes before the doctor, actually. The Reverend
Ooh.
Doctor Nerd.
A Reverend Doctor.
I would have been Reverend
okay.
Doctor Nerd if I had finished my doctorate, but I didn't. So now I'm just Reverend Nerd.
Master Reverend.
Master. Reverend Master.
Reverend
Goddess.
Master Christy.
Goddess.
There it is.
Nerd.
Here's the blooper tape. Nerd. Oh my gosh. All right. So anyway, fixing. What? When I think of fixing, it seems like the community trying to forcefully, or more, not always forcefully, maybe more directly adjusting someone's behavior because it doesn't fit what the expectations are within that community. And that could be the way people talk, the way people dress, how they're eating, where you hold the fork, how do you sit down, where do you sit down during a mealtime, how do you interact with someone, how close should you be to them, all of those things. And to me, fixing feels like that adjusting, and sometimes it feels like policing of teaching that person the repertoire that is accepted in that community to be accepted and move forward in that community. And when it's not like that, you continue to try to fix, quote unquote, that and adjust where you can, regardless of the outcome for the individual that is being fixed.
Yeah. That resonates a lot with me. That I feel that deep in my soul.
Yeah.
I can think of all of these things that like my family, we went to church. Church was a thing that we did, and that was a place that it was really hard to sit still, right? You pay attention. To pay attention for me means to move. I fidget, I stim, whatever your words are for needing to move in order to pay attention. So my family would be like, pay attention, and then they would smack me in the arm or in the leg, just like not harshly, not like in a violent way, but still
a jolt.
Like they give me a little
yeah.
smack in the arm or the leg. Or my grandmother had this way of like pinching the like underneath your arm, like in this like tender spot, and just a little. Like nobody else could see it, but she had that tender spot on the bottom of your arm, and she would just pinch, and you knew that you were doing something very quote unquote wrong in the moment. But I was oftentimes trying to pay attention because for me, paying attention required movement, but they didn't really understand that about how I paid attention. And so bouncing was considered not appropriate, especially when you go to church and there's church pews, these big long wooden benches that are, and everyone on the bench can feel you moving. And so it was very much stop that. So there was all of these little smacks. No, you're doing it wrong. You're not being appropriate. And yeah, there's a lot of things in my life that I can really relate to, where it felt like that's inappropriate behavior. There's things that come up for me. So I do EMDR now, which is eye movement desens. No, I what is the what does EMDR stand for?
I'm not a therapy.
Eye movement
I am actually a therapist.
desensitization and reprocessing.
Processing. Yep.
Come
I just pulled it up here.
and so it's basically bilateral movements. You used to do it with your eyes, but now they've realized you can do it with any bilateral movement. And so you basically look at that point in time and then do the bilateral movement, and it gives your brain a chance to like reprocess what you were feeling in that moment in time and to look at it as an adult. And so there's a lot of things that come up for me about, like, people used to say, "Oh, aren't you blunt?" And blunt meant that I just told the truth. That, like, I just said what I saw in front of me and I didn't really have a filter. And so that was a thing that was always coming up. Don't say that to people. Don't be honest. Don't say
Mhm.
those things. So that was one that came up for me. There just were a lot of things where it felt like that's not how we want you to behave. We want you to
Mhm.
behave in a different way, and please adjust. And if you don't adjust, there will be punishment. So
Mhm.
that's definitely a thing that I felt. I think a lot of people can relate to that. And I think we all relate to it on some level because
Mhm.
all of the adults in our lives tried to do that shaping of behavior in some way, right? But I think what's different for people with disability is that it's not something that can be shaped in that particular way because it's a part of who you are, right? There are things that are things that you can adapt and then things that you can't adapt. And so
Mhm.
there are things for people with disabilities that are not adaptable, right? Like you can't change the color of your skin. We know this. You can change the color of your hair potentially. So like
Mhm.
one is a thing that you can adapt, another you can't adapt. And so
Mhm.
one is a characteristic that you always have. And in disability, a lot of times the assumption is, especially before diagnosis, but sometimes even after, the assumption is that's a, a malleable thing, but oftentimes it's not. And so that
Yeah.
becomes the really difficult thing is that someone outside of your person is saying, fix it, fix it, fix it, change it, change it, change it. And no matter how hard you try, you're unable to do it.
Mhm. Or you do, and I feel like that's where a lot of masking comes in. Of you have this persona that takes a lot of effort and bandwidth and pieces of your soul sometimes to be able to present yourself in a way that people will accept and people will say, yes, that person fits. And you're like, oh, good. I'm not getting punished in this environment. But the thing that's supporting that is not getting reinforced or getting supported by the society. It's you're trying to avoid the dissent.
Yes.
And the thing that becomes reinforcing for that person then is avoidance of that. And to do that, it's almost like, all right, cool, here's this dummy person in myself that I've created, look at them, cool, substitute. And you're doing that kind of thing. And so then the fixing isn't teaching the person an adaptive skill or teaching the environment an adaptive skill to work as they are in this space, but more, when you're around me, in front of me, you must act X way. And in some ways that's beneficial,
Yeah.
right? Like the same jokes I say to myself, I would not tell my students or tell a police officer or tell my 4-year-old son, right? There's aspects of that where it's like,
Oh,
yes,
that's
you
why I
have to
keep getting
dichotomize.
arrested.
Oh, oh, biscuits.
Oh, there's the problem.
Research strikes again. Oh, but in all seriousness, right? Like we respond to things in different ways based on the level of feel good and not feel goods that we have in the environments that we have. And that's
Yeah.
okay. I think the issue becomes when the person says, hey, I'm following along what you all want here. I'm doing the thing. I got to tell you, it's eating at my soul. This doesn't feel good. I don't feel good about this. I feel like I'm hurting myself, and I feel like I'm hurting other people doing this by not being my genuine, authentic self. And I think the problematic piece comes with, well, you're doing a great job. And it's like, but so am I doing a great job at the masking part, or the hurting part, or the me being what you thought I should be part? So then fixing becomes this whole like context and this ball of yuck that includes other people's feels, my feels, and that little mask like path in between.
Yes. And I think about times where like I'm masking. People are like, good job, good job, good job. And then all of a sudden I can't keep that up anymore because the energy is too much. Something happens.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden, like because it breaks all at once, just this emotion pours out. And then I have moments in my history where it was like my mom was like, call the doctor, she's hysterical. And it was just this very like violent outpouring of my emotion and of like her emotion. And it was a very dysregulated, upsetting, like chaotic thing because I couldn't be myself. And then if that broke free, then it was very much, oh, this is a terrible situation. We need to resolve this in some kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
And it just felt, oh God, no, I can't ever be myself. Myself is horrible. And then I would just, as soon as that emotion came out, I would go right back to the mask. And I still do it today. Like I get around some of my family members and I whoop, put up that mask. Even when I'm trying to take it down, it just wants to pop in there because
Mm-hmm.
it's been such a part of my history and development and whatever else that
Mm-hmm.
like it didn't feel safe in that environment to be who I
Absolutely.
am. So yeah, it's very complicated, this concept of adapting yourself to fit into
Mm-hmm.
a space.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that for me with my own personal life, something came up recently with my son where he said, like, Pop, I really want to wear a dress. And I think, oh, cool. We'll find you one. We have friends that were older. We procured him a dress. So he wears that. He's spinning around with my daughter and they're having like the time of their life. This morning, he wakes up. He goes, I want to wear a dress to school. And the only thing I told him was, cool, you can do that. Just know that if you have to take that off later, we don't have a spare set of clothes, but we can send you with a spare set of clothes if you want. And he goes, okay, yeah, I want to wear it to school. And we're like, all right, game on. Let's do it. This is good. He's comfortable. And then halfway through, he took it off, like right before he went to school, saying that he was really worried at what the teachers are going to say, because in the past, they've said, you're not supposed to act like a girl or say that you feel like a girl today because you're a boy and you were born a boy and like all these things. And he says, the girls in my class will then make fun of me because they wear dresses and boys aren't supposed to wear dresses because that's their thing. But then he was saying like, but they can play with my toys and trucks. So why can't I be like them? And I'm like, this is a big conversation.
Yeah.
So, but with those things, it's the same thing I went through as a kid too, because I would want to wear women's clothes or what was perceived as women's clothes. And that was always tied to, when I was growing up, the disability side of things too, that it was like, oh, well, you learn a little bit differently and that's why you want to be different. And we have to be careful with that. You have to fit within society. And because you want to wear girls' clothes is because of your disability and you just want to be different. So you want to stand out, but it's not your job to stand out. You're supposed to mesh in with everybody. So you learn at the tender age of 5 that you're supposed to do these things that make other people comfortable, and you're supposed to alter what makes you comfortable in order for the comfort of others. And that went with, for me personally, types of clothes I wear, the people I chose to hang out with, the people I chose to like and be intimate with, the people who were around me as I was bouncing my leg all over the place or standing next to my desk because I could not sit down. And those same people now, some of them have said, oh, look at you now. You have a PhD. Look how great you turned out. And you have a partner and you have kids and everything turned out okay. You were just going through a phase. I'm like, I was not, I might still be in the phase. I just have an excellent mask for you
Yeah.
that I have cultivated and curated just for you. And I have that with most of the people that I meet and befriend. And it's tiring. And I know a lot of people, I'm also in a very privileged position. A lot of people do this a lot more and more intensely than I do, but it's hard. It's hard to see that and feel like it needs to be fixed. And now that we're raising the next generation, and Christy, you and I have talked about raising kids a
Yeah.
lot, and it's like that Spider-Man meme with the bus, and you're trying to stop the bus from hitting the person. And it's hard because sometimes you have to let your child come in contact with those contingencies so they form their own opinions, because sometimes in the effort to protect them and teach them this new repertoire, you are now becoming that person that's potentially forcing that person to mask in front of you, and you don't know what dividends it's going to pay until decades later.
Yeah.
And that's hard. So I think that when we're thinking of that fixing piece, I think a lot of myself, I think a lot of my family, my friends, conversations you and I have had, and maybe we need to talk about fixing differently and lay it out. Like, what are the societal rules? I don't remember taking any class in school ever that was like, this is how you interact with someone beyond kindergarten,
Yeah.
right? How do you interact with someone and make them feel comfortable? The only things we learned were, calculus, taxes are a thing sometimes, and I learned 4 dances in gym class, and that was our cultural training, and everything else was left up into the ether. So maybe we don't have a good repertoire or model for what fixing looks like, because we're all just figuring it out, and the only way to adjust and readjust and keep on track is to do it forcefully and not as a learning experience to have the person formulate it themselves.
Well, and I feel like that's the case, right? Like a lot of what I went through, a lot of the shifts that I made in my behavior were made because of bullying experiences, like really upsetting peer-to-peer experiences that I know were not just peer-to-peer experiences, right? Because there had to have been parental input into what created the rules for what was acceptable and not acceptable among us as peers. We weren't like left on an island, right? To like create our own situation. We were all influenced by what was coming down the line. So I feel like that also is true. And as a parent, I discovered that as well, as especially as my daughter got into the age group where a lot of that bullying happens. I would see the mothers in particular, because that was the circle that I was quote unquote in. Not that I felt comfortable there, but I just was a
I was around. Mhm.
feminine presenting human with child or forced into interactions with other feminine presenting humans with children. That is just
Mhm.
how you get placed, because if you go to the other side, then you have all of these societal implications as well. Oh, she's trying to steal my husband. The last thing I wanted was a husband, but like the first thing that they thought was like, oh, why is she hanging out with
Mhm.
them? I don't know, maybe they had thoughts, they were more interesting, they'd gone to college. Sorry.
Talk about other things. Wow,
They
what?
didn't just wanna be
What a
married and have
strange.
babies, which I didn't wanna be married and have babies. I don't know how that happened, I just fell
Yeah.
into it. And then so it was a whole thing where, though, I saw the parents behaving in these ways that were happening within the children's circle as well, right? So it was like, "Oh, I see why your kid is a bitch, because you are a bitch." Like, it was this whole, like, thing that was happening. And I was like,
Yeah.
this is what happened to me as a child also." Like, these bullying situations were because we were all stuck in this strict sense of how we behave. And so I understand now that none of us were, like, living in a space where we could be free. And that doesn't excuse anyone's bullying behavior because it's still not okay. However, I understand that, like, the people who were
Mhm,
treating me poorly were also getting this pressure to behave in particular ways. It's so
mhm,
funny because at one point, like, one of my uh good friends from childhood, like, we got together for coffee as adults, and she was like, "I'm so sorry that we treated you this way." And I was like, "You know what? That's okay because I it wasn't all your fault." And then we started having this conversation about things that had happened. And I said, "My mom used to do this thing where she would be like, 'Oh, but look at so and so. Look how so and so does this and so does that.'" And she was like, "My mom used to do that with you." And be like, "Oh, but look how Christy is so good at
mhm.
piano, and look how Christy does whatever." And it was like our mothers were using us as the standard and then comparing us to one another. And we were hurt by that. And we felt
Mhm.
judged and all of that stuff. But it was a thing that our mothers were doing.
Engaging in,
Yeah.
yeah. And that makes sense because if that's your only context and then you're around this small human all the time and then you see other small humans, you're like, wait a minute, this is different or better or worse, or my kid's the best or my kid could do better. And it creates all these like funky
Yeah. So
things,
all
right?
of these
So I
standards, it's interesting because we should talk a little bit about where these standards come from, Rocco.
exactly.
And I think for me, I didn't understand the medical model of things. I think the moral model of things was where a lot of stuff came
Yeah.
from for me because I was stuck in a very moral based
Hmm.
society. Very, Calvinists are very good at pointing
Hmm.
the fingers at sin. So anything that looked not like it quote unquote should be was deemed immoral or sinful or
Hmm.
not appropriate or like it needed to
Hmm.
be healed or that would be fixed in the next life.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and I think that's a really good point bringing up the models with this. So from another academic standpoint
yes.
by the Reverend Dr. Rocco. When we talk about these models, it's ways that people approach things. It's another way to think about it as a worldview
Yeah.
and what are the reasons behind these models. So, for those listeners out there that don't know some of these models, I wrote an excellent paper on this that we'll
Ooh,
put on the bottom
yes.
with an excellent team. Shout out to my authorship, and I'll put that in the chat box as well. Medical model focuses more on, especially when we're talking about disability, focuses more on this individual has an impairment that we need to try to reduce that impairment as if they don't have that impairment anymore or to regular quote unquote normal levels of functioning in society. So for someone who's in a wheelchair, a medical model might say we need to get that person out of the wheelchair so they can walk around. Also, for things like chronic pain, this person feels crappy all the time and they don't feel good physically. What can we do to reduce that? Say it louder for the folks in the
I'm
back.
slowly
Slowly
raising my
raising.
hand.
We should put that in the descript, right? Where it's like Christy slowly raises her hand. Uh, so that's the medical model. The moral model that we were talking about too is that disability comes from a place of divine intervention. And that moral aspect of it is, oh, you are disabled because insert reason here. So in my case, when I had cancer when I was younger and then subsequently had a variety of different disabilities afterwards, our community said that my parents were living in at the time said that was because my parents were living in sin and they did a lot of interesting life choices and God's punishment and learning lesson was to gift them a 6-month-old child with cancer and then who had disabilities afterwards. Other moral model things that we see even in literature, we think of the Scarlet Letter, and the priest in the Scarlet Letter was deformed by his wrongful approach of women and engaging in things, which, listen, not a good idea that he did that in the first place. So I'm not condoning it. But the way that they personify that and visualize that is in disability. And it's almost as if disability is that punishment to be able to say, you did this thing wrong, or someone in your previous life did this thing wrong, and you're sent here as a lesson. The moral model also has I don't want to say positive, but a less intensive side where an individual with disability is placed on this earth to teach other people
Yeah.
things. And that kind of goes to what you and I were talking about, Christy, with fixing, where it's, okay, this person is here to teach me something. What does that person want to learn? Or what does that person want to engage with in their life? And there's a host of other models. Sociopolitical, that talks about the environment, is the one that's disabling this person. If someone in a wheelchair can't enter a building because of the stairs, they're disabled from doing that. But if the environment creates a ramp, that person is no longer disabled from entering the building. So when we look at these models, they're different worldviews and different approaches. So when we see something like fixing, it fits more into a medical model of, oh, I need to eliminate or decrease that thing. And maybe the reason why we're doing that comes from a moral side of, this is a punishment, this is something we have to ameliorate or repent or
Yeah. Pray
what have
for.
you
I'll pray
for
for
those
you. Yeah.
situations. Oh my
Oh my
goodness.
gosh. Yeah.
Yes.
No, it's really
It's,
interesting too. So like we've planned for talking about this today, and I went to walk the dog this morning, met some people in the park that I often see at the park, and the one woman started talking about how she had been at a restaurant and she had met this other woman, and they were talking, and then she realized there was something not right about this child who was 4 or 5, and turns out that she says, "The baby had cancer. The baby had cancer." And she said, "Children don't deserve that. Children don't deserve that. Children don't deserve that." And I immediately thought of Rocco and this discussion, and I was like, children don't deserve that, but no one deserves that. Like, cancer
yeah.
is not a thing that you deserve or don't deserve. Like, cancer is a thing
Mm-hmm.
that just happens. It is a thing that happens, and it happens to some of us, not potentially all of us. It happens to many of
Mm-hmm.
us. It happens in many different ways, at many different times, and for many different reasons, but it's not a thing
Mm-hmm.
that you deserve or don't deserve. So it was very interesting for her to be talking about that. And then she's like, "I started to cry." And I was like, "You started to cry. You're in no way affected by this at all, but
Yeah.
somehow you felt like in a restaurant with people you've never met, personally affected enough that you felt that you had some sort of right or responsibility to become emotional." And it was just a very interesting interaction for me, because I was like, this is how people often still to this day react to these sorts of things. And I was like, yeah, it's this concept of you deserve or don't deserve something disabling. And
Mm-hmm.
and so when I hear people talk like that, and then I think about, so then what do we have to do to quote unquote fix it? And I think about some things you can work on fixing in these ways, and other things it's not an illness, right? It's not a thing that's treatable. And so if you have a spinal cord that's been severed in a particular place, like you're not going to walk. There's not like walking is not necessarily the end goal for most people that have a particular type of spinal cord injury, because that's just not going to happen. And it's not that I am trying to be a jerk right now and say, "Hey, you're not going to walk again. Get over it." Because that's not how I see it. But I see it
Mm-hmm.
as there's a factual point, right? Where like this is not a
Mm-hmm.
capability for your body. And there are things like exoskeletons, right? We've gotten to the point in time and in science where you can literally strap a person into a, a robotic machine that acts like another skeleton that you can then utilize.
Mm-hmm.
However, that's not even a thing that everyone can use. You have to have a certain amount
Exactly.
of muscle strength, you have to have a certain amount of feeling and particular parts of your body. You have to have an amount of trunk strength. So, not everyone that has a spinal cord injury can even utilize those kinds of machines that are
Mm-hmm.
giving you an aid. So, sometimes when we look at this like fixing of people, we're really like creating a bar that no one can meet. Like you
Mm-hmm.
can't meet that standard. And the standard is not fair. And I think
Yeah. And
this idea of ableism that I recently came across, I think is one of the things that I appreciate because it talks about how unfair really the standard is and how multifaceted and multi-layered that standard is.
Hmm.
And so they say, and it comes from Talila Lewis, and it says ableism is a system of assigning value to people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, productivity, desirability, intelligence, excellence, and fitness. And then goes on to say that the constructed ideas are deeply rooted in eugenics, anti Blackness, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. And this systemic oppression leads to people and society determining people's value based on their culture, age, language, appearance, religion, birth, living place, quote, health and wellness, their ability to satisfactorily produce or reproduce, excel, and behave. And then they make the point that you don't have to be disabled to experience ableism. And there's so much wrapped up in that to like talk about the standard then. The standard then is not just having a body that's unaffected by disease, not disabled, but one that
Hmm.
behaves in a way where the body is almost a machine, right? The body
Hmm.
is utilized for production, reproduction. The body is utilized to do stuff within the system in this particular way, where
Hmm.
like only non-disabled, white, moralized bodies count.
And that kind of goes back for me to that idea of productivity and worth and value of how that person operates within that society. Can that person either or both contribute to society and add something to it, or at least not remove things from the society and not have equal resource balancing, right? Where, okay, I'm doing this job, which is providing a service for society, but I do need extra care. But then there's some kind of like mental, moral balancing acrobats that have to be done in order for that person to be seen as capable of things
Yeah.
and to be seen as a legitimate part of society and not a burden to society. And I think that's where a lot of those ableist ideas come in of, well, we need to fix this person if they're not meeting those standards, if they're not producing the things that the society is expecting, or at the very least, if we can reduce the amount of burden that society has, that society would need to do in order to bring that person up to whatever level that society deems appropriate. And in doing so, though, we have places that completely separate individuals with disabilities, not necessarily because that's what's best for the person, but that's what's best for the quote unquote environment and the flow of a classroom or the flow of a workspace. Let's remove this person because they're slowing things down. And that, I think, becomes the real crux of a lot of this and why that fixing becomes such a powerful thing. Because at the end of the day, if there was better representation and more environments of success, there's not necessarily problems to fix. It's like we said before, if the environment is supportive of that person and that person can go about their day and the built environment and the social environment is done in a way where that person doesn't feel judged and they can access these places, there's not a problem, right?
Yeah.
There's a quote unquote problem there,
Yeah.
right? And ableism kind of dies because if the environment is universally designed for things like that and for multiple types of folks with different abilities and approaches and comfort levels to engage in an activity, which means sometimes people need more help, quote unquote, to be able to do an activity. We should be really looking at those activities in the first place to
What
possible.
is the activity and why is it creating limits or yeah.
That's not to say that some fixing is not warranted, right? Christy, you and I have talked a lot about chronic pain or like you you break your leg, or there are things where it's, hey, medical model the crap out of me,
Right,
please.
like
I
I'm
don't want
having
to
a
feel this
heart
pain
attack, like
anymore.
take me straight
Like,
to the emergency room and roto-rooter that
absolutely.
thing out. Do whatever you need to do. Yeah.
Exactly.
There are
Exactly. Yeah.
absolutely,
Fix that for me, please.
absolutely
Thanks. Yeah.
things that are medical that need to happen, and I am all for
Hmm.
them. There are also things that like if that is a thing that I require in order to make my life better, then I should have
Hmm.
that. I should have that assistance. And I think there's
Exactly.
definitely this. It's so weird because I've had like becoming a wheelchair user who's ambulatory has been a weird one for me because that seems to
Hmm.
be a limit that people treat all sorts of ways, right? Being in a chair versus standing. Like somehow walking is like this thing that you want to do, right? That's the measure of health. And why would you want a wheelchair if you have legs that work? And it's no, but I have only a particular amount of energy that I can put forward. And if walking takes up 95% of that energy, and then I only have 5% left, that seems ridiculous. And so it's been proven time and again that people with my particular disorders do better if they have that support. So use the power wheelchair, and then I have not 95% of my energy depleted, but only 5% of my energy depleted by getting around. And then I have 90% to give, right? Or more. And
Hmm.
so it feels like a much better thing. But I have had doctors say to me, you can't use a wheelchair. You'll have muscle wasting. You won't get up again. You'll forget how to walk. I'm not going to forget how to. Who forgets how to walk? That's not a thing that happens. You
Minus traumatic brain
right.
injury. Yes. Let's. there,
There are people
there
who
are
forget
situations
how
where
to
that
walk.
does happen.
Okay, let's
Yeah,
clarify. There
yes.
are situations
Yes.
in which you forget how to walk, but
But most
not
of the
in the
time, no.
situation where you
Yeah.
are an ambulatory wheelchair user and then your legs
Hmm.
and your brain just stop connecting because you sat down.
No.
Rocco, if you sit down for an hour and you stand up, sometimes you're a little stiff. Sometimes it takes you a minute to get going. If you drive
Yeah.
cross country, it takes a little longer for the legs and the brain to connect. But it's not like you
Hmm.
forgot walking. You didn't forget walking.
Exactly.
So it's
Exactly.
just a really odd thing where no, you need to be more upright. That's better. Being more upright is better. Somehow that's a
Yeah.
standard that someone got in
But
their head, and now your quality of life will suffer. And it's no, my quality of life is better sitting down. Like, can't I tell you what my quality of life is or is not?
and that's the
Like,
key, right?
yeah.
Exactly, because the fixing piece has this inherent, in many cases, has this inherent power dynamic. Now, I would love to see a space in a world where fixing meant it was led by the individual who wanted to do it because as an individual they wanted to do it, not necessarily because they only wanted to do it to fit into society, or they only wanted to do it because there was outside pressures for it, but because they were like, this will increase the quality of mine own life,
Yes.
right? But where fixing occurs the most is not in that
Yeah.
situation. And it's about pushing other people down and saying, no, you have to do X. And granted, listen, there's things we have to do, right? And there's things in society that you have to do that we don't want to do. Listen, I don't want to be wearing pants in public. I get it, right?
I
I don't
want
want
you
to have
to
to pay
wear pants in
taxes.
public.
I see. I appreciate that. Thank you. They have to be stylish pants. But like there, and I don't mean to reduce that down so much. You're sick and you have cancer, and the doctor said you need to take this medication so that you can survive. And if that's something that you want to do, these are the things you have to do. We get
Yeah.
that 100%, right? That there's stuff we have to do. Where it becomes a problem is when it gets to the stuff where we don't have to do it. Or it's like, say sorry to that person. It's like, why would I say sorry to them? Because you hit them. Yeah, but they just beat me
Right?
up and I hit them back. Why am I apologizing? That kind of feels like a tit for tat thing, right?
Yeah.
And or there's situations where yes, you were called too blunt, or you had an outburst, or you made someone else feel uncomfortable. And I think there is this sensitive balance of what feels right in situations like that and what doesn't feel right. And that context changes all the time,
Right.
because you might say the same exact words in the same exact group, in the same exact space. At one time, it's, aha, that was a funny joke, we're all laughing. And in another context, it's, you have hurt my soul, dishonor on you, dishonor on your cow. Like, it's hard to navigate those situations. And I think even as we're talking about this, some of the solutions that we come up with then can also be constraining for other people.
Yeah.
And that's the crux of humanity, right? Like, we have to operate in the gray and bend and adjust. But I think at the core, if the environment is accepting of the person trying to figure it out, and you're helping the person figure out the ways that they feel comfortable as led by them,
Yeah.
that's the goal. Not, I'm going to tell you what feels good, I'm going to tell you who to love, I'm going to tell you how to learn, I'm going to tell you blah 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 blah
Yeah.
blah blah. And it's a very like downward
Exactly.
motion
And I
on that.
think like the key there is, like you said, navigating the situation. But there's no, oh, I'm going to teach you now the formula for life. No, like I'm going to teach you how it feels to navigate a situation appropriately. So I think that is really the key. What does it feel like to be regulated? What does it feel like to be calm? What does it feel like to state your truth without being harmful to other people? What are those things, and how do we navigate those situations? I feel like, for instance, with your son, okay, yes, you can do this. And people say these things because somehow we have this false idea that in our society it's okay to be more masculine and to become more like a man, but it's not okay to
Mm-hmm.
become more like a woman. This is a
Mm,
concept that's wrong. So if you want to behave in ways that make you more like a quote unquote woman, that's okay. But we need to
yeah.
understand that some people might make us feel really bad for doing that, but they don't
Mm-hmm.
understand what we understand. So you need to
Yeah.
know, is it worth it to feel bad because these people don't understand the same thing we understand? Or is it not worth it to feel bad today because those people don't understand? So your teacher's not going to understand. Do you want to show your teacher, hey, I don't
Mm-hmm.
care that you don't understand and I'm going to keep wearing the dress? Or do you want to just let your teacher be in charge of how we behave today? And when we get
Mm-hmm.
home, we can behave in a different way. And I think there's these ways of expressing that, like, you get to be you, but you don't always get to be all of you all of the time, right? And I think that's
Mm-hmm.
the key. I think for me, because the fixing was the core thing, right? That there was never this teaching me that being regulated was the good thing, right? So it was
Mm.
like, you need to now put yourself in a situation that feels uncomfortable and bad and yucky, and you need to force down whatever's natural and do the thing that feels wrong. And so, as an adult today, even I struggle really hard with, can I set a boundary? How does a boundary feel? Do I know how to set a boundary? What is a boundary? Who gets to set the boundary? Do I get to set the boundary? Like, all of these things are still there because I wasn't taught how to navigate a thing based on, Christy needs to feel calm and regulated and safe and happy in this
Mm-hmm.
space. And even if she might offend someone else, she is allowed to have that. As long as I'm not
Absolutely.
harming someone else, I get to feel safe and happy. They get to feel safe and happy. I get to feel safe and happy. And that was the thing that
Yep.
was never figured out for me. And so I think when we talk about quality of life, right, and the value of humans, if we just put everyone on an equitable plane and say, we all get to have equal access to safe and happy.
Mm-hmm.
Like, isn't that
Yeah.
just
Or
kind of
equitable.
like,
Because it's sometimes people need a little bit more. And I think that it comes back to that empathy component that, I don't know, I'm sure we have mentioned this on pretty much every episode at one point.
We're like broken
I
records
feel
now.
like,
We're just like saying the
yes,
same shit
y'all
over
get
and
this yet?
over.
Y'all get, put that on a teacup. But, but I feel like just repeatedly, and we see more research coming out about this, and we see more coaches doing this, and we see more representation of doing things like this, of finding yourself and being your authentic, genuine self in these spaces where you might not always be accepted, and how to deal with that and how to learn with that. And, but also how your authentic self might interact with other people's authentic self or less than authentic self, right? And not noticing, well, are they doing that because they want to or because that's making you comfortable? And sometimes because that makes you comfortable is an okay thing, right? There's plenty of things I do in my relationships that I do where it's like, this doesn't really do it for me. But you know what? For me, it's more worth this person to be comfortable in this moment. But that's a choice. And that's a choice that I'm making because that's what I want to do, not because that's what I'm forced
Yeah.
to do. A lot of that, though, the more we talk about that, it's okay, how do you interact with other people? How do you do this in a way that's comfortable for you? What do you want? And how do you label that? How do you label your own emotions? Can you label your emotions as you're getting more increased anxiety about something and saying, oh, I'm at a level 3, I'm a level 4, I'm blowing up, it's happening. That sounds a lot like kindergarten, right? There's like kindergarten, first grade of like, where's that social emotional learning? That's the kind,
Yeah.
if people in the United States are legally bound to have an education system until they're about 18, right? And then 22 for individuals with disabilities. And then there's this drop off. There's almost this thing like that education was enough. They're perfect to be these humans now. No, you have met the minimum requirements to human as an adult in this society now. But then we completely drop all this other stuff. And then people get really lost and they get depressed and they have high anxiety and the huge amounts of burnout. And the thing that fixes it is going back to those kindergarten skills of, what do you want to do? Did you do something that makes you happy? You know what? This is a huge mess here. Why don't we clean this corner here? And then we can move on to something different after we have a little snack and a nap. And those are the kinds of things I would like to see as a fix in society to say, how do we work with the emotions that we have? How do we take that empathy and take that perspective of other people? How does that relate to us? And work through ways like that makes sense with the repertoires and the bodies that we're operating in.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? It makes so much sense. I think so many of the people that I work the best with at this point in my life and who are able to understand and cope and like weave together in a functional way with me are people who are invested in social emotional learning at this adult level, right? Like, oh, I'm going to read this
Yes.
book. I'm going to go to therapy. I'm doing EMDR also, right? Like, we are the people who are like, oh, you know what? Maybe we do need someone like a kindergarten teacher to guide us through how to function. Like, we didn't figure it out. We just need to keep on figuring it out. Yeah. And I think that makes so much sense for us to just continue that learning, to continue to say, "Oh, how do I behave in ways that make me feel good and also make the people around me feel like they have a value and also have an equitable sense of I feel good." Yeah.
And sometimes that means finding new people. If you have the privilege of doing so, though, too. Not everybody has the privilege of moving out of their neighborhood or going to a different place, or starting over is scary. But I think especially with the advent of globalization and technology, we can connect with other people virtually, and finding your, I don't want to say finding your tribe, that's not the best use of that term, but finding people that share the same values that you do, that accept you in a space, and being able to discover that, so that the fixes that occur are led by you and not led by people saying, hey, here's the mold you got to jump into. And you're like, that's great. I found this other mold, though. I want to do that for a little bit.
Yeah. Like, here's the space that I want to exist in. That's how I want to function.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know. When we think about this in a disability context, it's easy to talk about this not in a disability specific context because we experience this. Many people experience this. And I would argue that pretty much everybody listening to this now, past, present, future, has experienced this to some degree, right? You had to act in a way, you were forced to do something, you were insert uncomfortable repertoire here, right? When we put a disability spin on this, to me, I think so much of that, where that fixing comes from, is a lack of awareness and acceptance of people with disabilities in those spaces where you have a therapist, you have a behavior analyst, you have a teacher, you have an assessor, you have a school psychologist, you have people coming in saying, my whole job is to identify the things that aren't working and fix it. That's my whole job. That's what you're trained
Like,
to. But
here's your list of deficiencies. Let me come in and name them all. Yeah.
Exactly. But the issue is those list of deficiencies come back to what the society wants, and those norms, which one are very homogenous, meaning most of those tests are normed on essentially Midwestern white middle class folks. So if you don't fall within that band and you're being compared against a group that you are not in very clearly, and it's not in your community or people that you feel comfortable around, you're being compared against that as the norm. So then that inherently creates this us versus them component to it. And what we forget then, or what people forget then as those therapists, as those assessors, as those teachers sometimes, is maybe your job is less on that fixing piece, and maybe your job is more about spreading and disseminating adaptation skills, like you were mentioning before, Christy, of like, I didn't necessarily want to be told what the right answer was, but I did want the space to be able to say, what are these emotions I'm feeling? What are those emotions this person's feeling? How am I going to make this situation more comfortable? How am I going to work with this other person to make this more comfortable? And maybe that's where things need to push. And I think so much of that comes back down to, well, we also need to understand and accept that there are these differences without adding the but afterwards, right? It's not saying, I understand that there's a disability here, that this person is hugely impaired from this thing, that they're really depressed and they have high anxiety and this environment's not successful for them, but I just can't change it. And it's like, well, cool. So the but just wiped away the whole half of that. At the same time, sometimes that's a reality where it's like, I would love to be able to shape this environment in a way, but I do not have the time or the resources to be able to do that successfully for you. And everybody loses in that situation.
And I think sometimes, what can you do? That's the other thing. What can you do? I feel like sometimes people get caught up in the what they can't do, and they don't think about what they can do. Sometimes it's so easy. Like, I feel like, oh, I can't get you the software that helps you to dictate the answers, blah, 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 blah. I can't give you the more time. I can't get you whatever. Oh, could you record me speaking? How is that not the same thing? Oh, hey,
and
you
we win.
putting answers, permanent product. Like you said them, they came out your mouth, they're on the thing. Like, why would that not work? And I think so many times, like, people don't stop to get creative with responses to things. They're just like, this, that can't do it. And I'm like, okay, how could we like spin this? How can we be creative with this and make it be something that works? And so a lot of times, we get caught up in the can'ts. I can't do this and I can't do that, and you can't do this and you can't do that. Okay, what can we do? Where can we find common ground? And then also, like, the assumption that one thing is better than another, never great. I've had speech therapists say to me, you don't want to sound like Hillary Clinton. You want to sound like Ariana Grande. And I'm like,
what does that
I'm
mean?
like, do I though? And the idea being, you don't want vocal fry. You don't want these pauses. You don't want to force your voice. And I'm like, right. Okay. So yes, Ariana Grande has this other kind of voice. And so I understand that these are two different women with two different styles of speaking, but one has been gauged as appropriate, good, helpful, proper. I don't know, like why? Is there something wrong with the vocal fry of Hillary Clinton? Am I going to harm myself by speaking like Hillary Clinton instead of Ariana Grande? Because it's not natural for me to talk like it's not
Hmm.
natural for me to talk like Ariana Grande. That takes a lot of effort for me. It doesn't really work very well for me to put all of my voice up into my face. It's very natural for me to just have vocal fry and have all of these issues that are issues with my speech, apparently. Whatever. If
Hmm.
they're an issue for you as a listener, I apologize. Also, I'm not going to change the way I speak because it takes so much time and energy to go through speech therapy over and over. And it doesn't change unless I consciously make it change. So I don't have the time in my day to be conscious of every time I'm speaking. And I think that's a
Hmm.
thing that people need to understand also is like you might weigh it and go, this is better for you. This is more appropriate. This is how, as a speech and language pathologist, I want you to speak, right? Good, great, fabulous. I have things in my day that I have to pay attention to that are not my speech,
You're like, this is so bottom shelf for me
right?
right now. There are so many other
So much
things.
stuff that has to be like how I
Yeah.
don't know how I'm gonna pay that. I have an
Yeah.
$800 gas bill, asshole. Like I don't really care
Well,
about Ariana Grande's voice right now. I will
yeah.
Hillary Clinton it all the way home. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that goes back to what we were talking about before of bringing in that entire context and maybe even just delivering information versus saying that this is the right way to do it. Of some people do it this way, some people do it this way. Let's help you find your voice. Like maybe you shouldn't be dropping F-bombs every 10 minutes in this professional setting. Maybe that's something that we need to adjust, not fix, but maybe there's a very tasteful F-bomb that you can drop halfway through.
I like the F-bombs. I don't know, like that
I do
I get
too.
that
I wouldn't say all the
I do
time
get
though.
that
I
though,
think like
like,
after the fifth one in a
people are
minute, that might
like
be
I get
like
that sometimes where people are like, "Write in your authentic style, don't use profanity," and I'm like, "Those 2 things are
then
not in alignment.
exactly.
I can't write in my authentic
Exactly.
style and not use profanity." Christy is
Exactly.
profanity.
But I think that comes but then that comes down to okay, then who needs to be doing the adjusting in that case then? And it seems like there has to be more of this handshake between the environment saying, "Cool, I want you to help I want to help you figure this out." And not say, "Oh, nope, that's not it. Oh, nope,
Yep.
that's not it." And we're just saying a lot of nope and not like reinforcing the good or saying, "Hey, you approached that a little bit differently than I think I would have, but we ended up with the same product. So that's pretty
Yeah.
cool. That felt good. You did a good job." Praise the process, not the product.
Yeah.
And not just the product, I should say.
My sister still tells me I'm not allowed to swear.
Ah, fuck it.
Like, I'm her elder sister. She's my little
Yep.
sister. Who gets to make the
Yep.
rules around here?
Oh man, and I sort of to tangent on this with you here, that just some of the swearing because that's part of my daily everything, even in professional settings to a certain degree. And then our kids started dropping f bombs at the daycare, and I'm like, I don't know how I feel about that now. I don't know if this is good or bad. And I would ask the teacher, saying, "What was the situation?" He was carrying a box of toys and he dropped it on his toe, and he said, "Fuck," and I'm like, "Ah,
That
not
seems like
it's
the
not wrong
appropriate
usage."
yeah.
I understand that maybe there's another way to say those things too, but so it's hard
My
balance
daughter
that.
got in
But
trouble in, I think, 2nd grade or 3rd grade, because she called one of the girls a bitch, and then,
uh,
like, I got called into the office, and her teacher was like, I mean she's like, "I had to punish her, but she called it like she saw it."
see, but then there's the context where it's okay. The administrator saying, "Okay, personally, listen, they had it coming."
Like
As an
like, we don't
administrator, I
allow
have to
this,
do certain
right,
things
like, we
about this
don't
now.
allow this, but
Yeah,
also, that
yeah,
kid is a
yeah.
bitch, yeah.
Jeez.
Okay.
But But to tie that back to what we were talking about before, it's the whole context.
Yeah.
So everybody's entering this situation with their own learning history, their own constraints, their own expectations on
Yeah.
that. And sometimes those things interact with each other. The thing that seems to be lacking, though, is that transparency component of, I know you and I have had a lot of conversation. Maybe we'll have a whole episode about that one day, of like where it's, I can't operate legally outside of this box. And you're like, that's great. Also, we got to make the box bigger.
Yes.
And I'm like, yes, cool. How do we do that?
How? Yes.
But it's hard. It's not a straightforward process. And sometimes the effort on either party can be too much for what that person does in their daily life. And that's the part then, to me, I say, okay, this now is a larger societal issue coming here in a very real way for both parties involved. This is, we have two people that are like, I need to do this. The other person's, I want to help you do this. We're trying to figure out ways. Here's some solutions. Awesome. Box comes in, screws everything up. It's, here's a solution. No, we can't do that anymore. Oh, okay. Here's a new place. Oh no, we just fired that sector of it. Oh, if you just told me you didn't want me to succeed, just tell me. Just
say
get it out
so.
there. Let's rip the Band-Aid. Don't drag me along.
I think that's part of it, is just to be honest about it. Maybe we can't be honest about it, because being honest about it would actually be like, oh yeah, no, I'm deliberately breaking the law. I'm like, I don't care about.
I am definitely following the law.
Like,
Wink,
I
wink,
don't
wink,
care
wink,
about
wink,
disabled
wink.
people. I'm not going to do anything to help them. I really don't want them here at all. You can't say that. So what do you say instead? Oh, I'm sorry, but I guess the administration just can't support that at this time because we don't have the resources. And so maybe it's a euphemism for, we hate disabled people and we don't want them here. And that I think is the line that sometimes you have to figure out how to dance across, because you're like, okay, now do I push harder, or do I say, this is not the place for me, and I try to find a new place? And sometimes there's not a new place. Sometimes you are where you are, and that's all there is. And that's when you have to be like, no, this is where I stand and I'm not moving, and you're going to have to move. And then there's other times when it's, okay, no, we have to figure out how to work our way through this. But I think a lot depends on that honesty, though, on saying, no, I'm trying to work with you. These are the parameters within which I have to work. How do we fix this? And I like to think that there is a fix, right? There has to be a fix. And I'm always like, who do we have to go to fix it then? How far up do we take
Where's
this?
that
Where
pivot
do we
point?
go to make it change? And then don't stop until it has been changed. And I don't know, people will say to me, oh God, Christy, you're too much of an idealist. That's never going to happen. And I'm like, but
But if we don't start asking that question now, then it will, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy
and
that it'll never happen.
yes, that's exactly where I'm at with things all the time, is if we don't push for the best, then we're going to not get it.
Exactly.
That's exactly.
And then you have to accept it. And I think that's where I've seen in society a lot now. I should say society is a very broad term for Facebook Reels, where there's more and more talk about like bringing stoicism back. And I think there's a lot of weight to that, of sometimes there are things that you cannot change, right? And you talked about this at the beginning, Christy, where it's like the angle of my mobility stops here. That's it. That's what I'm working with. And I think there's some stoicism associated with that, of cool, now that I have that, this is information that I can use to operate. And okay, I accept this component. Awesome. I accept that tiny component, not all the limitations it brings, but that there are limitations that it does. How do we do the workarounds associated with that? And I think that if we keep pushing this ideology of like, you just got to suck it up and do it. You just have to go through. This is not what it's going to be like, or this isn't going to change in your lifetime. And it's, well, you can do both though. I can deal with the crap now because I know that the little incremental changes that we are doing in our lifetime are going to lead to much better things later. And it's this tiny steps, and it's that taking that 10,000 foot view and saying, cool, yeah, right now, this isn't going to fix the problems. There isn't a fix for these problems. Let's accept that component of it. But there's 58 steps we can take to get closer and then pass it off to the next
Yeah.
people and pass it off to
And
the
I
next
think maybe
people.
that's the point is if we accept that these are particular limits, let's not keep putting energy into fixing the thing that's unfixable.
Exactly.
That's like,
Exactly.
okay, for the few people that could maybe be in the exoskeleton with the millions of dollars that it costs and the ridiculous kinds of things that you need to have been tested for and be able to do, right? That only touches 0.00025% of the population of disabled people. So that's
Exactly.
almost no one. So we're putting all of this money and energy and whatever else into what if we could make people who are never going to walk again walk? Okay, what
And-
if we took that money and we put it
Well-
into supports for people who are never going to walk again? What if we did it that way,
Exactly.
right? What if we came up with creative strategies for how people could go out hiking with their family without
Yeah.
using their legs?
Well, it reminds me of I tenderly call this the Mythbusters ideology, where like Mythbusters as a TV show on the Discovery Channel, which was a great channel for a long time, was like, oh, here's this local story, here's this local fable, right? People said, oh, this person jumped off a building, they held on to a piece of plywood and they were able to float down, or oh, the butter side of the toast always lands up, or
Yeah.
whatever, but what have you, any of those things. So they test it as is. This is the story. Cool. Sometimes it worked and they're like, holy crap, the butter side does usually land up. Wow. Okay. I didn't know this would happen. And then other times they're like, wow, that didn't work at all. And then if it didn't work, their next question is, okay, what do we need to do
To make it
that
work.
work now? And in the context of a TV show, they said a rocket car, but what if we actually attached a rocket to the car? But can we take that same ideology to supporting people with disabilities where it's, okay, cool. Someone said that this worked. We tried that, didn't work. Okay, cool. What would it take to work and what are the incremental steps we can do to get there, and maybe triage it where it's, okay, here's the 15 things that we need to change right now. 5 of these are realistic. Awesome.
Let's
Give me the
do
5
that. Yeah.
things so that we can.
And that's the thing that I
let's
keep
start
thinking about.
there.
I remember, so like when I got my wheelchair, they were like, you're right-handed, correct? And I was like, caveat, technically, I've always been right-handed. Yes, I'm losing function in my right hand. So maybe it would be better if I start driving my wheelchair with my left hand. Let's just start there. Let's not
Yeah.
wait for my right hand to lose function. Let's start training me to drive with my left right now. And they're like, but you're still right-handed.
Okay.
Yes. They're like, the insurance form asks if you're right-handed. And I'm like, okay, yes, the insurance form can say that I'm right-handed. I still need my control on the left. And they're like, why do you need it on the, because I'm losing function in my right hand. I don't work because
Why
of
is
my
ambidextrous an option?
right.
That's like a
It
very
was
common
so
thing.
like ridiculous. And so it took extra time for me to get the wheelchair. They had to set it up differently. They had to whatever else. And so I get it and it's on the left-hand side. I go in to pick it up and I have my splint that I wear whenever I leave the house, right? And it's got my thumb all like my thumb when I leave the house, my thumb is smooshed to the rest of my hand so that it can't move. And she's like, oh yeah, no, you never would have been able to drive it with that thing on. And I was like, thank you. Like, why did we make this hard?
What a great idea you had.
Like, so great that we thought about putting it on the left-hand side. Because even though I'm right-handed, like the struggle that I've been having for 11 years now is that I can't use my right hand. So thank you for putting it on the left. And it was just like one of these things where, no, but the form asks me if you're right-handed and you are right-handed. So your control should be on the right-hand side. And I was like, can we just open up our thought process for 1 second and listen to the person who actually has the thing? And I know that you can do this, right? I know people that drive with their foot. It's a possibility.
Exactly.
Let's just imagine the possibilities based on the body that I currently live within. Let's just do that.
Exactly. And I think that's a good place to start, maybe like wrapping this component up, because we covered a lot of these topics of here's this starting point. What do we do with that? How do we teach people to adapt and not fit and force and do those components? Are there any organizations, Christy, that you can think about, or like movements or things you've seen, maybe even just media of things that you've seen that have maybe exemplified some of this more like inclusive, slowing down pace kind of approach.
Yeah, I definitely think the disability justice movement, just that's a large thing, but just disability
Hmm.
justice in and of itself is saying not just like we need to look at disability, but we need to look at these deeper things that come with it. So, like, how do colonialism, imperialism, race, all of these things, like, how do we fix more than just bodies? I really like the book, and there's a workbook with it as well. The Body is Not an Apology. Really nice one that really talks about like how do we not look at ourselves as a piece of this capitalist system, right? That needs to behave in particular ways in order to be a cog in the machine, right?
Exactly.
Because I think that helped me break down this idea that I don't have to be functional, quote unquote, in this way, and I don't have to produce a thing in this way in order for me to have value. So that was really helpful for me on my journey
I
to
like that.
just like figure out that I have value in and of myself, however I show up in the world, and I get to define how that is. So
I
that
like
is
that.
another one. And then, of course, as soon as you, of course, I have 1,000 places in my mind, and then as soon as you say it, like I can't think of any. I'm trying to think of what is the art space, the dance and art space. I'll maybe I'll think of it and we'll add it to the note
Sure.
because I can't think of it right now.
Yeah. And I mean, and for me, a lot of the people that we've listened to on the show, I think, are doing that work. And that's the point of us doing this podcast of saying, look at these great organizations that are approaching this component. Like the OKC airport is doing, trying to create that built space so that it is more accessible, so that if you do need to take more time is a precious thing, but time is reacted to differently with people depending on the context and how much sound is happening, things like that. We listen to activists, we listen to other folks. For me personally, when I see more educational practices, there are universities now that are doing, I don't know how they do the accreditation, because once I figure that out, I'm doing that at my place. Because it's amazing. It's truly like actually self-paced. Not, oh, it's self-paced, but you have 3 months to do it. Then that's not self-paced. But they do a class and you do the class until you're done. And that could take you a week, that could take you 6 months, and that's okay. But there's natural contingencies with it, that there's natural rules that you run up to that. If you take too long in between, you're going to forget some of the things and not be as effective. So but it's up to the person to figure out what that looks like for them, right? They're not just moving forward to just do things, to just engage in busy work because there has to be some kind of bullshit grade associated with that. I really like things like that. I like organizations that are creating those adaptive technology components of, oh, you have this issue that you're running into, that you person are running into, and you say, oh, I need a cup holder on my wheelchair. I need this special thing because I don't have full use of my hand, but I also want to text because my thumbs are working perfectly fine, but I can't hold the phone long enough to use my thumbs to text. Oh, here's this thing that you can do to fit like a glove and is relatively easy to put on and it's not taking more effort than it's worth to that individual. You put the phone on, things like that. Or how do you adjust your house? Oh, I'm a permanent wheelchair user now. I want to lower all my counters so that I can get to the things, right? I want to be able to use the stove and wash my dishes and get the stuff that I need to get. So like that's the kind of stuff that I see when we think about more of that universal design, more of that inclusive design. It's also gaining steam though, because most of those things that tend to work for people with disabilities, we just heard this from folks from Lunadesk, Lunadesk, also fantastic organization that's
Yeah.
doing something similar to be able to build this. Your workspace doesn't have to be at a table, could be on a floor, could be outside.
I
You can
know.
stand,
I
and you
just got
adjust for
one.
that.
I just got a desk.
It's beautiful.
I can use it
I'll post a picture
everywhere.
for
I
that.
know. I need to.
But that's the beauty of that, because then what the individual said was like, okay, what tends to work for people with disabilities tends to work for everybody. So maybe the standard should be people with disabilities, because if people with disabilities can access the space everyone
can access the space.
Exactly. Well, I don't know. So I would love to have more of a conversation on this and maybe send this out to people. We're most likely going to be putting this up on Facebook as a discussion post, and we'll send this out a couple times just to really get a lively discussion going on with this, because what other things have you, the listener, approached where you've had to fix? And maybe what were some of the solutions to adjusting with that? Did you find workarounds? Were some of those workarounds not workarounds and you just had to leave the space? We just want to hear all sorts of stories that people are running into, and it doesn't necessarily have to be disability specific. Intersectionality is a component, and disability intersects all cultures and all approaches. These are things that maybe you've experienced in your own life, but I would love to keep this conversation going, because obviously, Christy, you and I could talk about this for a
Yeah.
long, long time, but I want to hear from the rest of the folks.
We definitely could, but we want to hear all about you and about your experiences as well. That would be amazing. And
Amazing.
so feel free to, jump on the Facebook. Also, feel free to send us an email at disabilitytangent@gmail.com. It always takes me a minute to remember what our
Me
email
too.
address is. I don't know why that's so hard for me. It's literally just the podcast name.
Look at email below. Yeah.
Oh, and Sin's Invalid is the place that I was trying to think of that does really cool performance project stuff. I don't know. It came into my head. I don't know why it's important, but I felt like when you said, who I don't know, you were like, who would you point to? I was like, this one. We'll put that in the notes as well. But yeah, I feel like my final thought would be like, don't feel like you need to fix yourself or fix other people. Like it's an outdated model, and do we need to fix our society in some ways? Probably. That's probably a good thing, but I think that fixing doesn't mean quote unquote fixing. I think it means
Mhm.
adapting and adjusting and becoming more open to everyone.
And I think the more you show up as your authentic self, the more people gravitate towards that, and you find the people that will allow you to do that.
That is
And those are the people you should be spending your time on.
absolutely true. That is the thing I am finding, and I think I'm probably a broken record in that regard as well, where I keep saying it over and over. Like the more I lean into myself and stop masking and start saying, hey, this is my weird, wonderful self, and if you can handle it, then you're my people. The more that I do that, the more my people show up and hang out, and it's a good time. So
It's a really beautiful
I
thing,
think, yeah,
right?
feel encouraged by that. If you're out there and you're like, oh, everybody wants to change me, just stand in who you are and your people can find you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Sweet deal.
Fabulous.
As hosts of the Disability Tangent podcast, we love hearing from our listeners. Your thoughts, feedback, and questions are what keep our podcast going and growing.
So if you've been inspired, moved, or even challenged by anything you've heard on our show, we want to hear from you. Share your stories, your insights, and your questions with us by emailing disabilitytangent@gmail.com.
Whether you're sharing a personal story, suggesting a topic for a future episode, or simply want to say hello, we're here and ready to listen.
So don't be shy. Drop us an email at disabilitytangent@gmail.com and let's keep the conversation going. Your voice matters, and we can't wait to hear from you.
That's all for today, folks. Until next time, remember to stay engaged, stay curious, and above all, stay connected. Thank you for listening.
How do we put that on a t-shirt? just a
find a
photo
way.
of you doing that.
Oh, man.
I can't do it. I have
That's
too
how we
much
get to
vocal
LA.
fry. Hillary Clinton.
Oh, but if you were Ariana Grande, you could do it all.
I could do it all day long.